My name is Elizabeth Quiche. I direct the Kenan Institute for Ethics, and I am delighted to see such a wonderful crowd here. I thank you for braving the cold and the snow and the ice, and for many of you, I think, also trekking, making the trek to a perhaps unfamiliar part of the campus. And I can certainly assure you that you are in for a treat. This metaphor of going into unfamiliar territories or of crossing boundaries is rather appropriate, I think, to this occasion. At the heart of the Kenan Institute's mission is an effort to bridge theory and practice, to bring scholarly discussions about ethics, justice, and the good life into fruitful and mutually enriching conversation with practical struggles to teach and to practice ethics. The Kenan Lectureship brings to the Duke campus a distinguished speaker to address moral issues of broad social and cultural significance. Our hope is to bring scholars who are deeply engaged with today's practical moral challenges and practitioners who are thinking and theorizing in creative and innovative ways. With this year's Kenan lecturer, Professor Martha Minow, we are privileged to have someone who, as both scholar and practitioner, speaks with great nuance and wisdom to the public challenges that we face and the moral challenges that we face in our families, our classrooms, our communities, our nation, and our world. And someone who is an extraordinarily kind and good person to boot. I would like to thank the Kenan Faculty Council, faculty leaders from all across Duke University for their help and support, especially the Kenan Lectureship Committee, which consists of Professors Tom Metzlaff from the Law School, Anna Lind from the Fuqua School, and Jeremy Sugarman from Medicine. I also want to thank the wonderful staff of the Kenan Institute for Ethics who have worked very hard on this event, especially Susan Brooks, Doris Jordan, Melanie Mitchell, and Cheryl-Ann Welsh. And I'm delighted to welcome and to express my gratitude to the folks who make all of the work of the Kenan Institute for Ethics possible, the Kenan family and the Kenan Charitable Trust and Funds. We're delighted to have Betty Kenan and Tom Kenan here, as well as Dr. Richard Krasno, head of the William R. Kenan Jr. Charitable Trust. So we welcome you and thank you for your support. And now, to introduce our speaker, I invite Professor David Wong of Duke's Philosophy Department, a member of the Kenan Institute's Faculty Council, and an old friend of Martha Minow's, to introduce our speaker.
It is an honor to introduce Martha Minow, and the fact that we are longtime friends. Beginning from the time we conducted seminars using literature such as Sonny's Blues and James Baldwin, seminars for district court judges, and since then participated in many wonderful discussions together. That makes it a special pleasure. You have in your brochure Professor Minow's many impressive affiliations. The fact that not only is she a professor at the Harvard Law School, a fellow of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, is serving on the Independent International Commission on Kosovo and on the numerous boards and major foundations and centers you see listed there. Just to mention a few of her affiliations and roles. And I think E.J. Dionne, that quote, had it exactly right. Martha Minow is one of our nation's wisest and most engaging public philosophers. In a series of path-breaking books and articles, she has tackled some of our most thorny problems. For example, problems created by the unstated assumptions that guide and misguide the way we treat others we see to be different, such as children, persons with disabilities, women, and ethnic, racial, and religious minorities. Problems centering on group identity in a pluralistic society, such as segregation, racial redistricting, affirmative action, gay and lesbian rights. Problems arising from tensions between the goals of seeking justice and achieving reconciliation in response to horrific collective violence, such as occurred in Bosnia and Rwanda. And most recently, the growing trend towards privatization of many of the services previously provided by government, as is manifested by for-profit companies managing our schools and religious groups providing job training and food stamps. Running through all of Professor Minow's work is an unmistakable compassion and an unwavering focus on the question, what good can we do? What should we do to fulfill important needs for which we have collective responsibility? What is to be done for those who have suffered mistreatment, injustice, and violence, and how can it be prevented in the future? Her compassion is most obvious for those in urgent need or who have been wronged, but she also treats people on all sides of difficult issues with generosity, stating their best arguments with fairness, and seeking to reconcile conflicting points of view based on the wisdom that many different kinds of people have to be part of the solution and cannot be dismissed as part of the problem. She shows us why the usual answers are too easy. She demonstrates virtues rarely found in, well, the same law school, much less the same person. Idealism, tough-mindedness, hopefulness, realism, theoretical rigor, and a willingness to deal with the supreme messiness of the most urgent practical issues. And I've saved one of the best things for last. Martha is a brilliant disciple of the philosophy of Yogi Berra. So please help me give her a warm welcome.
We'll do that later. Well, it is an absolute privilege to be here and a real thrill to be introduced by two very good friends. The Kenan Institute has already spread its good word out in the world, and just spending a day here with many of the people involved, I can see why. I'm a little jealous. I didn't bring the snow, I promise. It wasn't me. But because of the snow, I was prompted to look into some of my own favorite quotations about snow. You see, it's something we think about a lot up north. And one that I found that may seem a little odd by someone named Tove Jansson is, "You believe it's cold, but if you build yourself a snow house, it's warm. You think it's white, but at times it looks pink, and another time it's blue. It can be softer than anything, and then again, harder than stone." If you haven't had snow for a while, let me tell you, this is all true. And I'd add, and this is going to be on my tombstone, it's complicated. My suggestion today is that digging deep into complication can melt frozen debates and identify new paths. Enough with the winter metaphors. I promise I take as my topic privatization, and by that I do mean the experiments in the United States to privatize aspects of schooling, welfare, social services, dispute resolution, prisons. Although the term privatization covers a variety of different activities, I mean here the range of efforts by governments to move the performance of public functions into private hands, or to use market-style competition. Current privatization efforts involve both for-profit and non-profit organizations, including religious entities, in performing public responsibilities or addressing public needs. These developments do cut across many fields, and state and localities have launched experiments in school choice, including vouchers for private schooling, charters for startup schools. In fact, my own work in this area started with a focus on schools, but I at one point looked up around me and realized it was happening on so many aspects of public life. When the Supreme Court of the United States this summer decided that school vouchers are constitutional, it really signaled a green light, not only for privatization in the context of schooling, but across the board in public activities. Other activities that cross boundaries include not only profit and nonprofit, secular and religious, but also public and private institutions to deal with the social welfare issues in the United States. We all know that the voucher experiments in schooling uses public dollars to purchase private education, and typically this means private education at religious schools. But we may not all know that many public school systems also contract with private management companies, including for-profit companies, to organize schools. Public education dollars also support entrepreneurial charter schools, and they mimic markets by offering parents choice among schools, but also among programs within schools. In addition, public law federal and state and local, outsource many welfare programs, managing them now by Lockheed Martin, one of the major managers of welfare programs in the country, or, in some places, churches and religious nonprofit organizations. State and localities also spend federal dollars with religious groups that run Head Start, participate in community service block grants, and operate children's health programs. Publicly traded companies and religious groups manage prisons. For-profit companies and religious groups run welfare-to-work programs. The relationship between these kinds of public programs and private activities is particularly drawing public attention when the private groups are religious, because there is a special treatment in the Constitution about the relationship between government and religion. Given a scarcity of other good options, publicly funded vouchers may pressure people into religious activities they would not otherwise choose, and this poses jeopardy to religious liberty. Fear of religious coercion or religiously motivated intolerance animates those who most steadfastly oppose these kinds of initiatives. And yet others indicate, and I think with some reason, that excluding religious groups from competition for public programs that are otherwise available to all kinds of comers is itself a kind of discrimination. The provision of social services by houses of worship, in particular, is a top priority for President George W. Bush. You may have seen this week, it was in the newspaper, that he has approved the use of public dollars for building places of worship with the use of funds for subsidized housing. State governments fund social service programs that incorporate religious practices or are run under religious auspices. But beyond the special issues posed by constitutional concerns about church and state, separation of religion and government, there are additional concerns. Teachers, for example, warn that school vouchers for private schools will drain needed resources and also engage families away from the public school systems. State and national initiatives that are intended to raise expectations and student achievement may be jeopardized if school systems can use vouchers to send failing students to private schools that are exempted from those requirements. For-profit prisons concern a lot of people who wonder if the profits are made by skimping on legal protections or reducing the quality of conditions. Other people object that a function like punishment is fundamentally governmental and should not be contracted out. I have a lot of these concerns. I have a lot of worries. I'm a little bit like Lily Tomlin, who said that she worries that the person who thought up Muzak may be thinking up something else. But I have one worry I haven't seen many other people talk about, and that is a worry that we're also witnessing a shrinking of public space. When courts uphold the rights of owners to restrict free speech in shopping malls, the avenues for public expression are diminished. There's a hit Broadway musical right now called Urinetown. It satirizes a world actually in existence in parts of this world right now where there are no free public restrooms and people have to pee to relieve themselves. To relieve themselves. More abstractly, the settings for public debate and deliberation may be shrinking as key decisions about schooling, social services, prisons, and healthcare are made by private groups with public funds. Public control and review, whether it's through administrative or political processes, diminish as previously public activities now are controlled by private management control. So the Edison schools in Philadelphia do not open their books. Do not let the government that is paying their contracts see actually what is their balance statement. It's not publicly available. Local, state, and federal governments make many but discrete decisions to subcontract social services, prison and school management, to invite religious groups into government programs and public spaces, to cut back on public programs, to promote partnerships using joint venture for capital development, to distribute public benefits in the form of vouchers redeemable in private settings, to solicit private underwriters for public initiatives, to impose fees or other restrictions on public programs. And ordinary people are not consulted, and if they are, it's only in the role of a consumer. How are you satisfied or not in the resulting service? Not as a citizen engaged in assessing and shaping the polity. Many of these decisions are in fact made without public notice or opportunities to participate. And with the effects buried under a welter of specific decisions, it's no wonder that there's little public debate over the kinds of services that warrant public subsidy or provision by private institutions. And in the meantime, the emerging arrangements jeopardize public commitments to equality, to due process, to democracy. I think we should stand back and take a look at these developments. And I think if we stand back, there will be some ground for comfort for those who like privatization and some ground for greater concern than people have raised. I think when we stand back, we see that actually we're just in the middle of a new chapter of a long-running story of a complex relationship between public and private in this country. And in that sense, it's not such a big deal. There's not such a change. On the other hand, I think that when we stand back, we'll see that a lot of public values are quietly being extinguished. And I disagree with that. I think that when the public pays, public values should follow. Public values themselves require public debate and deliberation. That's not happening. Whatever the limitations of my argument that I will make in the remaining time about these developments, I think that the privatization trend is undeniable. State, local, and federal governments are widely using privatization, and skeptics should not simply decry this reality, but deal with it by demanding public accountability. Before the voucher decision in the Supreme Court, I can tell you there was only one question: is it constitutional? Now that it's constitutional, a lot of people are called up short. They haven't done the thinking about what kind of privatization, under what terms, with what conditions. Well, folks, the time is here. We have to have that debate now because it's legal. It's happening around the country. Should it happen, and under what terms? It's ironic to me that a lot of this is occurring precisely with the scandals revealing the failures of accountability in publicly traded corporations, in religious institutions, and in governments. And the issues, therefore, for accountability ought to be before all of our eyes. We ought to not have any particular great confidence in any private form or public form in making sure that the tasks that we've entrusted institutions to perform are being fulfilled. So accountability will take center stage by the time I finish today. First, let's compare past and present. In some ways, our time mirrors the early 19th century with rising confidence in private initiative, voluntary action, and religiously inspired responses to neglected children, mentally ill people, and prisoners. Historian Willard Hurst argued, and I quote, "Belief in the release of private individual and group energies furnished one of the working principles which give the coherence of character to our early 19th century public policy." During that period, local and federal governments used land grants, tax exemptions, and other techniques, such as encouraging very supportive interpretation of corporate and antitrust laws, in order to stimulate private efforts in the service of public aims. Today, there are perhaps some departures, but it's a very similar effort to mobilize public support to trigger new private action. And there's a faith in competing private initiatives with a vision of public values, along with, again, a strange and interesting mirror to the early 19th century, respect for religious inspiration, along with hard-headed faith in markets. So it's not particularly novel to ask how much public resources should be privatized. One financially strapped municipality in 1849 sold the public square to private interests, but then the state Supreme Court found that this was a violation of public purposes. Last year, New York Mayor Michael Bloomberg proposed to redress the enormous budget crisis in his city by selling naming rights to city parks. He triggered jeers and parodies, but there haven't been any lawsuits yet. Even as governmental activities increasingly begin to address the needs of children and disabled people and poor people all across the 19th century, philanthropic and voluntary agencies created new institutions. Today we call them nonprofit organizations. Many of these institutions in foster care, adoption, were private agencies. Many of them were religious. They formed the central elements, in fact, of the communal response to public need. Gradually, they became publicly regulated and publicly subsidized. But in many communities, they actually retained their private status and engaged in performing public functions by contract. Today, the creation of private dispute resolution agencies, some of them are for-profit, some of them are religious, actually revived traditions from the 19th century, when similarly, all across the country, there were private dispute resolution systems, whether they were done by commercial groups, by religious groups, or neighborhood communities. Nor is it particularly new to see religious organizations in the business of schooling and social welfare. It was, after all, religious goals that animated the early education efforts as America emerged as a nation. Religious groups initiated social services to tend to the poor, the sick, and the disabled, hospitals, child welfare, and all received public dollars for decades, at least through the last 50 years. Catholic Charities, over half of its budget is from public contracts. Usually such organizations, though, exist independently. They are not the churches themselves. They are not the places of worship. They are spun off in technical terms as 501c3 nonprofits. But the staff and volunteers are often, if not always, acting out of religious conviction and pursuing practices guided by religious teachings. We all know about the GI Bill, right? When President Franklin D. Roosevelt signed it into law in 1944 as an educational entitlement for World War II veterans, the government started a program that has since spent billions of public dollars to public and private educational institutions with no apparent objection, then or ever since, over the inclusion of religious schools. In fact, the conference committee report explained in its justification of the legislation that it included the word all before the phrase public or private in its definition of educational or training institutions in order, quote, to make it clear that church and other schools are included. Veterans initially faced unscrupulous practices by proprietary schools that promised programs that they did not deliver upon or otherwise engaged in fraudulent schemes. Revisions of the GI Bill through the years, therefore, have really attended to that, unscrupulous market practices, but never changed the availability of that money for payment of tuition in religious schools. And indeed, people can use the GI Bill to be trained as clergy. Despite longstanding American practices, therefore, of connecting public and private, profit and nonprofit, religious and secular, there are 4 ways in which today's initiatives depart from the past. First, the governments now use direct financing, directly writing checks to these organizations rather than simply using facilitating techniques like tax exemptions or favorable antitrust rulings. Second, current privatization efforts actually are occurring, of course, after the 19th century and the 20th century, after the buildup, if you will, of the government, after the creation of the welfare state. As a result, current privatization involves taking institutions that have been public and moving them offline, moving them out of the purview of public review. And in many instances, they appear to be also reducing or shrinking a social safety net, and at least reducing the ambit of public review. Third, the injection of market-style language and concepts into sectors such as education, social services, and prisons. This is somewhat new. To actually say that these values should permeate what many people describe as the independent sector or civil society. That's new. In the 19th century, it was much more likely to hear religious language permeating those activities. A final and distinctive feature of the recent public-private initiatives is the deliberate governmental effort to engage houses of worship, not only their separate nonprofit arms, but the actual ministers, the imams, the rabbis in the activities of promoting welfare-to-work transition, childcare, housing development. Defended in part as a way to include smaller urban denominations, chiefly street-front churches, African-American, Hispanic, and immigrant groups that do not create separate tax-exempt social service agencies. These efforts to include houses of worship in public-private partnerships also emphasize the value of religious practice itself, belief, faith, and community, not just secular social services for people in trouble. Under these circumstances, the government funds could be used to directly pay for religious practice and instruction. This is a striking departure from the past, and it is a striking departure from past constitutional interpretations that said that government dollars should not be used in pervasively sectarian institutions. American history scholars may point out that in the shift, the court simply returns to a conception of the Constitution that existed in the 18th century. But in any case, this change will startle a lot of people who are used to the way we've been doing it for over 100 years. Actually, there are 4 reasons to find all these developments good. First, there might be a big improvement in quality and effectiveness. Schooling, social services, prisons, and welfare, let's be frank, are not models in this country. People don't come to this country to see how well we're doing K-12 education or how well we run our prisons or how well our social services programs or foster care systems work. Judicial challenges claiming violations of individual rights in each one of these settings have actually been the growth business for the federal courts over the last 50 years. But courts themselves are slow and cumbersome and are not particularly good in doing some of their own work, which is why alternative dispute resolution has grown during the same period. Given the disappointments with public systems, allowing some other actors to take a turn makes some sense, allowing competition, promoting innovation. Private alternatives may achieve higher quality than public ones when they operate on smaller scales, pursue different philosophies, generate cross-subsidies, or entice new people to get into the business. Secondly, and it's related, competition itself can have some power to create incentives for innovation, increased efficiency. Competition gives power to critics, whether the critics are local governments or ultimate users, who can back up their concerns with the threat of taking their business or their vouchers elsewhere. Third, pluralism. Introducing private options supported by public resources can advance pluralism, by which I mean valuing the variety of ethnic, religious, cultural groups within a society and the virtues of tolerance and mutual accommodation. Pluralism calls upon the government and private actors alike to respect distinctive groups and their contributions to society. In the United States, our Constitution has long been understood to ensure parents a variety of educational options so that parents can make sure that their children take on, and I quote, additional obligations beyond those that are chosen by the state. But our tradition in this country, parents who want to do so have to come up with their own money to do so. In other countries, that's not the tradition. Pluralism could be advanced by allowing public resources to enable any parent to pursue schooling that is religious or has another kind of purpose in addition to the ones that the government approves. Pluralism, similarly, would mean valuing what it is that different religious traditions have to offer when it comes to treating substance abuse or improving welfare-to-work transition. It makes sense for a nation as large as ours to see the capacities of groups that are smaller than the entire nation, but bigger than the individual or the family. Group affiliations can encourage a sense of participation, self-governance, mutual aid, and care for others, while allowing freedom from the controlling force of a powerful government. But in a free society, groups must permit individuals to exit and to participate in multiple groups or no groups at all. And I'd like to just label this non-toxic pluralism. Non-toxic pluralism requires sufficiently overarching and pervasive civic virtues, such as freedoms of speech, equal opportunities for individuals, democratic participation, to temper the dangers of prejudice, demagoguery, group-based rivalries or domination, or simply exclusionary practices. Finally, fourth good feature of the new developments in privatization: they can stimulate new knowledge and infrastructure by drawing new people into the businesses that are previously handled by local, state, or national governments. They can promote experimentation, institutional innovation that all in turn can lead to new learning, new demonstrations of what works, new study about what works. In the very activity of comparing alternatives, new knowledge can and will be built. Now, for good reasons, and I'm sure that there are plenty of worries to raise, I can only come up with three. Here they come, but I promise you they're big ones. In turning to private actors to supply education, social services, dispute resolution, other programs, there's a very serious concern about governments ducking public obligations. There's a very serious concern about governments becoming too enmeshed with religion, or diverting public resources to private profits without gaining the discipline of a true economic market. Rather than achieving increased efficiencies and improved options, then, the privatization process risks reducing the quality, producing unequal treatment, or even outright corruption. Privatized programs can actually balkanize communities. It can produce less visibility for public access. It can also reduce protection for members of minority groups. So I'll identify these three as dilution of public values, potential mismatch between competition and the social provision purposes, and the dangers of divisiveness. So what do I mean by the dilution of public values? Very technically, under our Constitution, fundamental public constitutional values like equal protection, due process, only apply to government action, only apply to actions of the state. When the government contracts out with a private actor to run a prison, to run a school, to run human services, those constitutional protections do not apply. Even statutory obligations do not apply unless the government specifies them in the contract with the private actors. This means the governments can, intentionally or unintentionally, use the privatization process to do an end run around public obligations. This risk is especially salient when the private providers are religious institutions, because in addition to being free from the public obligations, the private institutions can also claim that they are entitled to a degree of privacy from public review and not even have to report their financial books, for example. If a church receives public fundings to run a welfare to work program, it can claim there's a threat to religious liberty if it's forced to disclose its records. Moreover, religious providers may demand a freedom to preserve the religious elements of their programs even after they receive public aid. Religious providers of job counseling that I know, I've talked with, demand that Bible or prayer study is a crucial part of their program, and you should judge them by their results, not by their means. Now, that may be just great, but if the government's paying for it, then the government's paying for religion. And is that what we mean for the government to be doing? Second, there's a danger of mismatch between competition and social provision. The assumptions behind competition do not fit many of the areas that have fallen to public provision. There's a reason why the government got in the business, for example, of providing foster care for children who have no homes. There isn't exactly a big market for it. There's a reason why there's a public commitment in many of these areas, because the rules of the market have not proven successful. The assumption in the school context, for example, is that competition will generate relevant and comparable information necessary to assess the quality of each school, that parents and guardians will seek out that information, make informed choices. Competition will generate more good schools, or failing ones will copy the good methods or else close. The competition will produce efficiencies in bypassing public bureaucracies. I think that there's reason to be concerned about the validity of each one of these assumptions. A central difficulty is the absence of reliable, comparable information that allows people to compare public and private schools. Typically in this country, they don't even use the same tests. It's very hard to find out how each school is teaching, much less how well the results indicate the success of their methods as opposed to the success of their selection processes for picking their students. Moreover, even if adequate information can be gathered, not all parents and guardians would get it, or understand it, or act on it. Now, it's true, anybody who studies private markets knows that this is true in every market. Not every consumer is an informed one. But theorists emphasize that all you need is a sufficient number of informed consumers who will, by making good decisions, signal to others who can free ride on their investment of time and research and behave as if they had the full information themselves. One little problem. Such signaling requires communication, and this is precisely what's jeopardized when informed and motivated parents leave public schools for private ones and are no longer in the same communities. Of course, there are many attractive schools in suburban districts that remain out of reach for families who cannot afford the real estate or are excluded by zoning. It's precisely those students who lack good choices and under the current regime who may also be stuck with the least desirable schools if offered choice and competition inside urban public settings. Third problem is the danger of divisiveness. I also think it's the loss of common institutions. Increasing choice and competition in social provision diminishes experiences of commonality and could foment distrust among groups that already experience racial or ethnic or religious tension. Again, schooling provides a very vivid example. In some parts of the country, there is already segregation along many lines, certainly racial lines. But if we promote more school choice, there could be even more segregation along religious lines, along ethnic lines. Without regulation, without specifying what are the terms for selecting students and not excluding students, we could end up producing a very segregated world along many lines where we actually need to be building more bridges. Privatizing social provision also jeopardizes the ability of individuals to imagine and participate in a public realm and have a sense that they know people, unlike themselves, that they've had common experiences, that they have common memories. These are concerns, and yet, here I go back and forth on the one hand, on the other hand. I told Elizabeth I'm looking for the third hand. I do think that there are risks and there are opportunities presented by the privatization activity. But I do also think, even I have understated the complexity here of the degree of interconnection that already exists between what we call public and private. And until we face up to the fact that there really is no sharp demarcation, we won't come to the possibility of seeing both public and private actors as engaged in a joint enterprise of meeting social needs. And if we see them that way, then maybe we can stand back and say, what's the best way to marshal both kinds of resources for public purposes? So let me say what I mean. Even without the new levels of privatization, government and private realms are deeply entwined in the activities of social provision. Take the tax exemption, which I've referred to several times here. This is a policy tool that's designed to create incentives for private actors to fulfill charitable and communal functions. The economists will tell us that it actually is a tax subsidy. A tax exemption means that a particular entity doesn't have to pay taxes. It means that they have more resources available than the ones that do. And the economists would like to say it means the government is actually paying for it. It's giving them a rebate, but just avoiding the operational costs of actually having them pay it and then paying it back. The relationship, therefore, between the government and a tax-exempt organization could be understood as a kind of partnership, a kind of mutually beneficial arrangement to advance shared purposes. And indeed, a nonprofit organization that does not advance the public purposes can lose its tax exemption. Actually, tax exemptions are simply one of many such policy tools that sit on a continuum of relationships between government and private groups. On one end of the continuum, there are government prohibitions that completely forbid the activity. For example, laws against criminal conspiracies. Moving toward the center, government permission, allow a group to proceed but not subsidize it in any way. Moving towards even further to the center is government encouragement by allowing charters or incorporation or offering individual participants protection against liability for the conduct of the group. Further along the continuum lie indirect government subsidies of private activity through exemptions, deductions, credits, either to the organizations themselves or to those who contribute to them. These policies give a public boost to the organization even while letting private individuals decide what to do with the resources. Next comes more direct government support, in which the government approves the organization. Yes, this school sits on the list of approved schools to receive public vouchers, or the government actually specifies the terms of the program. Even though individuals can choose then whether to redeem the voucher at a particular organization, the government has pre-approved the particular redeeming organization for that purpose. This is true in schools, this is true in welfare, this is true in a lot of areas of privatization. Further on the continuum lies government contracts with private entities to actually perform the government service function specified in great detail under contract, and even under closer government control comes form of partnerships that give both the government and the private actor a governance role, and sometimes even ownership roles. At the other end of the continuum, and this is not something we do in this country, are government establishments of private organizations, meaning government establishment of religion, government establishment of political parties, government establishment of labor unions. We don't do that in this country. But other than that, the whole continuum is here. And look at the tight interconnections that they represent between government and private actors. Governments, of course, can adopt unabashedly private strategies. They can back bond issues to finance construction of housing and schools, which are pursued by private owners or nonprofit entities. You can get a bond that actually allows for the payment of a private school. That's a decision that it serves the public interest to actually use public resources to have a private school. Private for-profit and nonprofit hospitals depend on public as well as private insurance payments and research funding. They couldn't exist without them. So if we see, quite honestly, these public and private actions as all in some form of partnership, all in some form of joint contribution, couldn't we more rationally assess what's the right mix of public and private? When should there be public conditions? When should there be tight public control? At best, maintaining avenues for innovation and effort through each of these channels can ensure competition, plural approaches for educating young people, addressing the needs of impoverished people or substance abusing people, meeting other social needs. But the world is not the world of the at best. At worst, and in reality, we have gaps and failures between and within public and private efforts that leave many, many people without effective schools or services and without obvious avenues for fixing these failures. I don't think I need to detail it. The waiting lists for homeless shelters, the waiting lists for alcohol and drug abuse treatment programs, the waiting lists, regardless of whether they are provided by public or private services. This is not a system that is working particularly well. My argument for conceiving of public and private efforts as a kind of partnership in this broad sense resists merging them. I'm never suggesting that we should eliminate the boundaries between public and private. I think preserving a notion of the private is crucial to the objective of pluralism and to the goals of competition that justify such partnership. Yet no less indispensable to such partnerships is the justification that assessing the combined effects of both public and private initiatives warrants a system that permits and sustains both, and that system is irreducibly public. By standing back to analyze these combined effects, we can strengthen the overarching rules and incentives that govern not only each sector, but also the relationships between them. In this sense, the often rivalrous, competitive, or parallel efforts may follow their own courses while abiding by rules against fraud or deception, anti-competitive behavior, illicit discrimination, violation of religious freedom. That private providers view themselves as marketplace competitors with each other or with government providers should not obscure this broader understanding of shared purposes. Just as adversaries in the process of dispute resolution, or teams in competitive sport, or even separate branches of government work in immediate rivalry and tension, but over the long term maintain collaborative enterprises, so do private and public schools, for-profit prisons and government prisons, religious social services and secular social services. Anybody who's in these businesses and cares about quality actually welcomes a worthy competitor. The law should promote effective results, efficient use of resources, and the benefits of competition and pluralism. But the official rules of the game must also ensure compliance with public values of fairness, equality, neutrality, and, for goodness sake, no fraud. When Arizona created a charter system for private schools, their immediate problem was outright fraud. Because they thought, well, the market will take care of it. Well, the market took care of it. People went laughing home with the money in their pockets. There must be a continuing role for government and government oversight. This takes me to accountability. Accountability, it seems to me, is the central question, not public or private. The question is, what are the rules and the methods and the procedures for assuring that public resources actually are used to advance public purposes? And we have to and must debate what those public purposes are, but we also have to devise, maintain, and replenish new and inventive ways of making accountability something that engages the public itself. What do I mean by accountability? I mean being answerable to an authority that can mandate desirable conduct and sanction undesirable conduct if it breaches identified obligations. In a democracy, the ultimate authority is the general population, organized as voters, served by elected representatives, including state attorneys general, school boards, tax enforcement agencies. A state government that contracts with a publicly traded corporation to run a state prison or to permit redemption of welfare vouchers through a religious charity should be held responsible for the consequences resulting from such contracts. Seeking accountability through such measures does not mean simply resisting privatization. It does mean coming up with goals and assessment experiments. It also means making sure that the democracy itself isn't sold in the course of the privatization activity. What are the public values? I have my own list. I think you have yours. I think what we need is a public process that allows us to debate them. But if the privatization activities are made in contracting, bidding activities by local governments, which none of us know about, where will we have a chance to contribute our views about what the public values should be? This nation, as reflected in its constitutions and laws, embraces complex and multiple social values. Freedom, community, abstract equality, religious diversity, individual and communal responsibility. These values compete, but they also hinge on one another. Individual freedom relies on collective rules and institutions. Religious pluralism depends on overarching laws that maintain tolerance and set limits on the government's involvement and the government's support. To promote such complex values, we need democratic debate over how to protect both the independence and the interdependence of individuals. We need to improve schools, welfare, healthcare, dispute resolution, corrections. Competition and plural approaches can help, but not without a larger public framework devoted to ensuring individual freedoms and mutual respect. Make the new experiments accountable to a diverse public. This should be the central and unrelenting demand by citizens and political leaders. So, how do we do that? It is curious, isn't it, that the expanding privatization efforts have collided precisely with the moment of the biggest scandals in this country about accountability in our history. Tell me a sector that hasn't been hit by them. So we have, of course, the Enron scandal and everything in its wake, which actually exposes that there are many activities going on in the boom period of the American economy that nobody wanted to pay any attention to. The Arthur Andersen accounting firm is not the only one that's going to bite the dust. The conflicts of interest and the fraud engaged in by the Tyco executives. Do I need to go on? But then there's the failures of the Roman Catholic Church to deal openly and swiftly with the allegations of sexual abuse by priests and to cooperate with law enforcement officials. Then there's the misleading behavior of the Red Cross in soliciting funds following the terrorist attacks of September 11, 2001. There's the diversion of funds by executives at branches of the United Way. There's the mess of the 2000 election and the way we didn't know how to count the votes, one way or the other. Show me a sector in the society that has actually performed very well on accountability in the last 5 years, and I'll turn it all over to them. I haven't found one. We need, in fact, to be devoting our best talents to improving the methods of accountability in each of these sectors. The danger is at this moment of privatization, we may, in fact, be pointing the finger in each direction, say, well, government's not working, let's hope the private system is working. Private's not working, let's hope the government's working. Guess what? There's a danger then we will actually lower the standards for accountability rather than raise them. And that, I think, would be a danger to all of us. The failures of corporate boards to perform their watchdog functions over management may grow from the tendency of those boards to be composed of friends of the chief executive officers or people too busy to become actively involved in corporate governance. Companies sometimes fail because of external events or badly timed expansions. Sometimes they succeed, at least temporarily, because of hype or faulty financial statements. Preoccupation with short-term revenues steer many corporations towards practices that do not build long-term value. If we turn schools over to corporations run these ways, it is the education of children that will suffer. How do we make the rules of accountability in the private sector meaningful so if private companies are entrusted with public action, they actually do what they're supposed to do? Nonprofit organizations often lack the criteria to evaluate their own performances. They also often have inattentive boards. Some critics charge that too many nonprofits and too many religious institutions lack democratic procedures. Others defend elite or hierarchical control, despite serious difficulties in recruiting and retaining high-quality leaders with integrity when they have many better paying and more prestigious opportunities elsewhere. Improving the performance of nonprofit organizations is as important a task right now as improving the performance of for-profit organizations. We just know much less about how to do it. And typically, there are fewer funds involved, so it doesn't hit the newspaper, but the problems are as severe. Collaborations between governments and private entities, whether they are for-profit or not-for-profit, secular or religious, could introduce accountability tools from one sector into the other in order to improve performance. The danger is that such collaborations could divert public trust into forms of conduct that already have faulty accountability procedures or use accountability mechanisms that are inadequate to public tasks. At minimum, the accountability framework itself must be public in its source of its norms and in its authority and enforcement power. So what's a public framework for accountability? For governments hoping to achieve both the desired ends and perceived legitimacy of our constitutional democracy, we have 4 traditions that are relevant. I don't know, there's 4 is my theme today, I don't know why. First, what may surprise many people who aren't lawyers, because it's contract law. But this is one of the major techniques that lawyers have contributed to the world of accountability. It's centrally concerned with ensuring freedom to exchange promises, but contract no less involves commitments of public enforcement. The apparatus for public enforcement of private promises is public, including courts, arbitration, or the mere threat of their use, including rules about what kinds of contracts are enforceable and norms about the kinds of sanctions that can be imposed. Governments use contracts when they work with private entities to deliver social services or to manage schools or prisons. A public framework for accountability around these activities would disclose the facts surrounding the contracting process to the public and permit the development of rigorous rules to make sure those contracts are fulfilled. The recent decisions by school systems to terminate relationships with for-profit school corporations indicate not only disappointment with results, but also the importance of ongoing public accountability for those contractual relationships. A second model for government accountability is constitutional obligations. And here I return to this danger that governments can bypass constitutional obligations by privatization. Where the explicit terms of the Constitution attach only to a government actor, as is true with federal equal protection and due process clauses, if the government then tries to bypass those rules in order to avoid those obligations, I think that we should become quite concerned and figure out some way to make sure that those underlying purposes are secured, if not always in the exact same ways the governments would. Third model of public accountability has a bad name: administration. Its synonym is even worse name: bureaucracy. But there is something, briefly, that I'd like to defend about it. Administrative action can become bureaucratic, complex, slow to change, driven by a thirst for power rather than results, or characterized by inflexibility. And yet, what many people call red tape or paperwork, in short, is what permits accountability. Because you know what? We count what we care about. This is especially the case when it comes to cost accounting and evaluation of performance. Requirements to collect information about applicants for vouchers, about attrition from schools, about decreases in staff, about complaints by recipients may add to the paperwork of lean operations of private entities, but the resulting data are essential to monitoring the quality of schools, social services, and prison programs. Many of the current welfare to work transition programs that are private do not keep data after people are terminated from benefits. We have no clue where they are, what's happened, so we can't evaluate whether these programs are successful or not. All we know is that there are fewer people receiving the benefits. What does that tell us? It doesn't tell us anything that we need to know. Paperwork, some of it is still required. The project of alignment makes public the knowledge necessary to account for the resources that, after all, are public to begin with and are intended to serve the public. The fourth legal model for accountability is democracy. And democracy involves processes and values that are committed to governance by the people. Usually this means popular voting, but it doesn't always have to take that form. It can also be a commitment to use democratic values to inform the design of administrative review processes and contracting mechanisms, including wide disclosure of information. Now, it's not merely, I think, a cute exercise in reflexivity for me to ask, how can we make our accountability mechanisms accountable? I think that that question is meant just to remind us that there is a cumulative impact of all of the phenomenon that I'm describing that would elude even the most democratic review of contracting activities by governments. What could be missed? How about the unintended or collateral consequences of particular decisions, more importantly, of the cumulative decisions to privatize? If the introduction of vouchers enabled more people to select private schools and the percentage of children enrolled in private schools in America shifts from its current level of 10% in this country, what would be your comfort level? 25%? 50%? 85%? What if over half of American school children went to private schools? What would be the effect on the development of an engaged and informed citizenry? It might be great, but it seems to me only if those private schools are held to the same standards we would expect any public school to be held to in terms of preparing people for democratic participation. That's not currently the requirement. If the language of competition and consumption overtakes social provision, that has a public purpose in domains like education and welfare. What will be the effect on a sense that we are all part of the same project? Will people learn to be consumers rather than citizens? Will people have a reduced sense of collective commitment to address the problems of anyone but themselves? How will privatization affect people's willingness to vote or to make sacrifices for national defense? If the accountability measures do not capture these kinds of effects, then they are not themselves accountable to the public values of democracy, equality, Here, a vigorous public framework will require inventive and searching inquiry. Maybe we need to have a commission, maybe it's a private commission, maybe it's a public one, on privatization, simply to gather the impact, to ask people, do you know how much of the current government is actually being run by private actors? Can we look at the effects? Can we shine the light? No part of this effort must include creative ways to generate demands for information about the processes of privatization, about accountability, about the space that's left for public participation. Unless communities work to ensure that more people have the capacity to make these demands, governments will not be accountable when they use private methods to meet public needs. Here, as in so many settings, the preconditions for our democracy are also its values. A population with the freedom and equality to pursue self-governance is both the end and the means of our political system. Vouchers and contracts, joint ventures and partnerships that join governments and religious groups, profits and nonprofits, could either undermine the alignment of ends and means or strengthen it, undermine the values of pluralism and freedom or strengthen them. The direction is up to us. And as I end, I have one more thought about snow. It is indeed winter. And in the winter, when it gets dark early, the causes that we care about, the causes of justice and the public good, may seem in hibernation. And yet the author Edna O'Brien said, in a way, winter is the real spring, the time when the inner thing happens, the resurge of nature. May this be a time when the inner thing happens, when there's a resurgence of the public good. Thank you.
Professor Minow, thank you very much, Martha. Professor Minow has agreed to recognize questioners, and we have a couple of microphones right here. So we will have some helpers, and what I would ask you to do is to please wait until you get the microphone
Turn it off.
to ask the question. Pardon?
Turn it off. Just need to use the thumb switch on the side.
Martha, when you talk about privatization, it occurred to me in the course of your talk that we might imagine that a great deal of the services provided for are already privatized. To begin with Medicaid, in the very beginning, food stamps, we don't require people to buy goods at particular grocery stores. Support for public housing, now that we've moved away from requiring people to live in public housing projects. All of those things seem to be, in a certain sense, not terribly controversial, even though we argue about how well they're provided. What is it, do you think, is special about education, just to take one example, that requires that it be provided by the state and state-run institutions, rather than giving people the same kind of choice we give them with respect to medical care and food and housing?
Great. Well, I hope I'm clear. I'm not someone who's opposed to vouchers in the school context. I'm not someone who thinks, in fact, I think it's appropriate and right that our Constitution assures parents choice of private schools. And I am myself compelled by the point that that choice should not be restricted to those with the money. I think that the examples, though, that you raise, whether it's Medicaid or food stamps, are extremely interesting to me because they're quite different than just outright cash grants. They really are not giving people money to go do whatever they want. The Medicaid actually, as we all know only too well, is highly regulated. Not only is it restricted to health care, only certain kinds of things will get reimbursed under certain kinds of terms. I'm not sure I would hold out Medicaid as a great example if we want to think about what's going to happen with schools, but I'm afraid that if we are really serious about making sure that public purposes are fulfilled in private schools, it's going to look something like Medicaid. It's going to look something like highly regulated. And then we're going to lose a lot of the gains that people hope will come from pluralism and competition and efficiency. That, by the way, is why many people who are in religious groups oppose the voucher movement. Because they say, with money comes strings. And with the piper comes the tune, and with the tune comes the piper, and so forth and so on. And I think that there really are genuine concerns there. I think there's common cause that people can make with the leaders of religious organizations and with the people concerned about public values about how to strike the right balance here. I do think that there is something that does make schools a little bit different than healthcare, for example, or even provision of food. And I've thought a lot about this because I've written in the past about comparing the use of vouchers in the healthcare context and the school context. And, you know, we've had, since the beginning of public funding of healthcare, the money's gone to Catholic hospitals and Jewish hospitals, and no one's ever raised a question. So why is there so much public debate about public monies going to religious schools? Well, I'd be interested in other people's views about this, but it does seem to me that irreducibly the task of education is about the inculcation of values. And the task of healthcare is not irreducibly about the inculcation of public values. There may be a cross on the wall, and there may be people praying over the patient, but that's somewhat remote from the task at hand, where the task of schooling is cultivating character, creating attitudes. So the centrality of the public mission is much greater, and the concerns about separation of church and state, I think, are understandably also much greater. I'm somewhat more willing to explore, to go down the road, to see can we work something out. I think that there should be voucher experiments around the country. I think they should be evaluated. I think that the schools receiving vouchers should be using the same tests as the schools that don't. We can see, are they working better? There's no absolute commitment to do that right now in either Cleveland or Milwaukee, the two communities that are experimenting with vouchers. That seems to me to show that it's a hypocritical experiment. If they're really serious about the outcomes, we should be able to compare them. But I also think that there should be public conditions on those monies. And I think, for example, those schools should not be able to exclude students on the basis of their religion. That's a controversial statement. I've been in very heated arguments with people who run religious schools who say it will change the character of my school if I have people here who are not members of our religious community. And I say, I'm sure you're right. God be with you. Don't take the public money. I think it's an easy answer. If you want the public money, you get the public conditions. Now, that's my position. I'd be interested to know your position. But whichever way you come out, I think when people start to realize large numbers of dollars are flowing from the public resources to private schools, they're going to want to regulate, and they're going to want to regulate in detail. And it could actually undermine the very strength of some of these private schools.
I'm going to come in and political science. I thought it was a fine and subtle talk. I wanted to question your analysis of accountability. Because as I agree, it's a central question. You define accountability, as I heard you, as answerability to an authority. And I think the problematic thing about that is the word authority. We speak of accountability to a public, to markets, to a profession, to one's peers, none of which is an authority. And it seems to me you have defined accountability too much in a centralized institutional way. And that has sort of warped the analysis. Because we think about reputational accountability. It's one of the most strongest forms of accountability from human on, reputational accountability. But that doesn't really fit accountability, answerability to an authority. So if we see accountability this way, then privatization may not look as big. Because one thing it does, because the way you look at accountability is what political scientists call the police control method. That is, some authority looks around and tries to figure out what's happening, gathers data, knocks on doors at night, and finds out where the criminals are. The other method is the fire alarm method, where you rely on people in society to raise the alarm. Now, if you privatize, you create a lot of competitors who are not happy about their opponents making more money than they are, and who have therefore an incentive to uphold the fire alarm and to invoke reputational accountability on others. And it seems to me, if you thought of it that way, you might have a little different and maybe a somewhat more favorable view of accountability and privatization.
I really welcome the question. There may be somewhat of a semantic disagreement between us. There may be partly a substantive disagreement. I think, and I'm going to look back at my notes, I defined accountability in this way, that accountability requires the answerability to an authority that has the power to sanction. And then I went on to use the people in the democracy as the chief example. And that's, I will still defend that as a view, but it's completely compatible with that view to imagine that the mechanism for sanctioning is in the hands of the people. And it can be expressed through voting, it can be expressed through exit, it can be expressed through using information that is generated. I want to make it clear, I am not a fan of the policeman state. I'm fond of saying, maybe it's only true in Massachusetts, you want the people who you have to wait in line to get your driver's license renewal to be in charge of child protection? I mean, this is not my idea of a good way to run things. So I am not a defender of existing public bureaucracies. And in fact, what I have found most exciting is an emerging set of literatures across a lot of fields where people are looking how techniques of generating information from the shop floor to create innovations in industry could actually produce better health and safety standards, could actually produce better environmental standards, could actually maybe produce better educational standards. Some people in law call this democratic experimentalism. Other people use it to talk about it as distributed authority. There are a lot of fascinating work going on in organization behavior, trying to see how can flows of information empower people who are not in a centralized form at all to produce the kind of authority and accountability we're talking about. So I think you and I probably agree more than you may have thought. Where we disagree is that even your example of the fire alarm, I think, except in very small towns, we still like to count on public provision of the fire service, and indeed public creation of the fire alarms, and public regulation requiring even new homeowners to put in the fire alarm. That is, we haven't privatized all the way down. And if you take another example, how about airport security? We had an experiment in this country of privatizing airport security. And after 9/11, boy, we just turned our back on that very much. And I just think there's some lesson there for us to learn. Now, how much of that is about appearances? Lots of it's about appearances, wanting to reassure the public, but not all of it. Some of it is that if your major mechanism of accountability is how cheaply can you do it, if that's your major mechanism, you're going to sacrifice some other qualities. And on some public purposes, that sacrifice is too high.
Let me play devil's advocate against myself. I was discussing with my friend Imka here on the way in that perhaps we as stereotypical right, me, and left her-wingers might be able to cut across dimensions in some way. And so this question might be atypical for me, but your talk seems to stress procedural and institutional solutions to social problems. And yet it would be easy for me as a religious person to say, well, the real problem is a moral deficit, and that no matter how many institutions for accountability we construct, if people are dishonest, they're going to abuse them. And so raising the European question, why can't we have a Finland or Sweden, where all services are provided publicly and everyone trusts each other? What's the obstacle?
Whoa. For what it's worth, Sweden is busily privatizing at this very moment. In fact, the social safety net that was hard fought all across Europe has been slashed to ribbons after the European Union set central bank requirements all across for membership in the European Union. So for one basic point is that certain measures of market competitiveness and strong currencies seem to be inconsistent with public provision of social services. Now, I said seem to be. I'm not confident that they are, but that's how our current modes of collective governance, Europe being the leading example, proceed. So Eastern European countries that had the best child welfare systems anywhere in the world, they've been cut to smithereens. And it may actually have counterproductive effects on full employment, certainly for employment of women. So the ultimate returns are not in, but that's one basic, just realistic answer. That another answer is that in this country, we have great skepticism about public provision of social services. And we have great skepticism for some of the reasons I think I've alluded to. One is the pluralism reason. That, let's go back to the history of the creation of the Catholic school. You know how it got created in this country? because during the period of time that public schools were being created as a universal institution, you know, with mandatory compulsory schooling, really wasn't widespread across the country until the turn of the 20th century, and that was only for elementary school. It wasn't high school until about the 1930s. There was a simultaneous response to new immigrants, many of whom were Catholic. And the explicit, you can go back and read the debates on the educators, the explicit position among them was, we need to assimilate these new immigrants and we need to bring Protestant values. And it was in reaction to the Protestant values that the Catholic hierarchy said, we can't do this. Initially, they sent their kids to public schools, and the Catholic school movement was created. There also was hazing of Catholic kids. There were lots of other things going on as well. Catholic schools in this country were a response to the experience of a particular group of the exclusionary practices of public social provision. And some people say a similar phenomenon is going on now. I don't think it's quite true. There certainly are assimilation activities that I don't admire, but many of them I think are much more sensitively done in this country right now, but partly because of that history. Pluralism and distrust across groups has made the public provision of social goods very, very difficult. Third reason is we have a very complicated history in responses to anything perceived as communist or socialist. So the political viability of public social provision is also very difficult. And then the final reason, I think, is also something I alluded to in my talk. I myself am skeptical about mass delivery of social services by governments, particularly when they're dealing with the sensitive issues of interpersonal relationships. How do you help someone who's been addicted to drugs? I'm not convinced that somebody who's working for the government because they couldn't get some other job is going to be the best person to provide the help. Now, some of those people are doing, you know, fantastic work. Some people, though, are given workloads that are not manageable and very difficult working conditions and no ability to improve them. And it's not always the best solution. I think having competition between public social provision and private social provision is a better recipe in terms of improving the quality of services. I don't know if that's a full enough answer. I guess one more thing I'd say is that as admirable and enviable a lot of the Scandinavian countries are, in my mind, when it comes to social provision, as they have larger and larger numbers of immigrants, particularly Muslim immigrants, they are encountering problems that look sadly familiar to ours. Debates in their legislatures about who are these people and what do we owe them, why do they have so many problems. It's starting to look a little bit familiar.
Thank you, Professor Minow. One area I'd like to probe a little further is the forces that are driving this desire, this fire, this burning desire for privatization. And I think beyond a question of quality or efficiency, I think there's also a deep-seated desire to change the power dynamics that individuals feel towards those organizations, whatever form they may be in, that are providing the services. And so my question to you is it not a call to arms, perhaps, for public providers of services? And you take the example of charter schools, where many parents, beyond an issue of quality or financial efficiency, feel deeply dissatisfied with their individual ability to affect change and to communicate their desires to public school officials, and feel much more comfortable being able to do that in a charter or even a private setting. And so my question is it not a call to arms, perhaps, for reform on the public side? Because we have a situation where we have a lot of citizens who don't feel a sense of ownership in the public provision of services, and yet do feel that sense of ownership in a private provision of services. And I wanted you to comment on that.
Right. No, I think it's an extremely astute comment. I certainly know that in the school context, the methods for public accountability look to be broken in many communities. The school boards are often large and bureaucratic, not responsive to individuals, and the school boards themselves are remote from the day-to-day decisions in schools. And so it's not a satisfactory method. One thing that I've found very striking is that even within the public system, You contrast special education, education for kids with disabilities, with regular education. Special education gives every parent rights of participation, every parent rights of individualized hearings. It looks much more like the private system that you're describing. And that leads me to conclude there's nothing inherent in the public nature of schooling that produces this experience of ineffectuality among parents. It just is the way that we've done it in the past. It's the factory model. I think that competition will be helpful. I think the competition that's already arisen with charter schools has led many standard public schools to try to produce new kinds of parent participation, parent involvement. We know the single most important predictor of student achievement in schools is parent participation. So this is not against the interests of schools. This is actually advancing the interests of schools to figure out ways to more effectively involve parents. What worries me, though, it's not about your question, it's about the issues behind your question, is that is there really only this choice for us, that we can be consumers or we can be citizens? What I think many parents find more acceptable in schooling is to be a consumer, where you have the ability to threaten to take your kid away. That somehow gives people a sense of more clout. The problem is, an awful lot of the issues I'm talking about are really not just about private consumption. Even the education of your own child is not only about private consumption. It's about public, other regarding activities. And if the only way we can feel powerful in our lives is by being consumers, then there's an enormous danger that we will turn our back on any public, interactive, collective good. And that won't be good for any of us.
Could you, well, in the examples you talked about today, they have involved flow of funds from the federal government or state governments to institutions that will enable privatization or expansion. Could you talk about twist on that we've seen recently, where there is now withdrawal of funds, withholding of funds for policy reasons? Two examples are stem cell research and family planning, where it is then the consequence of that is a forced privatization without controls.
Right. Well, it's a very sobering question, isn't it? One thing that we teach in the first year of law school is that the main way to lose control is to ban something. Because if you ban something, you cannot regulate it. If you ban it, you privatize it. I grew up in Chicago. The legacy of prohibition is still big in Chicago. The ban on the sale of liquor produced a market of enormous proportions. One of my uncles made his living in it. I'm not suggesting that stem cell research at this moment in this country is against the law, but it feels that way in many institutions because the usual sources of funding are gone. To privatize is to lose control. And if there are public values that are relevant to those kinds of research, it's one of the stupidest things a government could do, is to say we're not going to be in the business. It's also, of course, true that by refusing to fund, a government actually expresses enormous power. It shifts activity. I'm worried about the scientists who are going to leave the country and go elsewhere. So long-run consequences, it seems to me, have yet to be fully accounted for. I think it's an important point. This isn't where you were going, but I'll tell you, I am equally concerned that in the name of privatization of the sorts I've been describing, the government is disguising the shrinking of public funding, right? So they say, well, we're just going to shift who's going to be the service deliverer. It's going to be private delivery. But actually, they've also at the same time cut the budget. And by cutting the budget, the available quality of resources are much less. And then you contribute to that the loss of public constituency so that there won't be people lobbying to increase the budget so that the programs will be cut over time. I'm worried about that. So these tools are of slashing budgets are as draconian as any that I can imagine, and they actually lose the possibility for public debate and public control.
Ma'am, thank you for coming out. There's been a little bit of media buzz recently about the draft. What are your thoughts on 2 years of public service, or even the draft for providing a vehicle for inculcating public values, as you mentioned, and cultivating character?
Well, this may not be popular, but I am a big supporter of public service and compulsory public service. And I was involved in a commission that issued a report on this subject 15 years ago. I've been a big supporter for a long time. I think that many of us describe the World War II generation in this country as the Great Generation. I think there's not an accident that all indications show that it's the generation in this country with the highest levels of civic engagement, the highest participation in voting, the highest participation in private civic activities. And I think the participation in defending the country and also in being part of a multiracial, multi-ethnic, multi-class defense force contributed to that development. I also have great confidence that a couple years seasoning after high school would make college a much more meaningful experience. So I'm in for it as long as it involves the options of conscientious service outside of military service. I think it's a great idea. And I also think that it would be possible to have interesting public-private partnerships in the course of doing it. It started in Boston, but there's a wonderful program called City Year. It's very much this idea. City Year creates a core of high school graduates who spend a year or two doing community service. It's now spread to several other cities. And it's a nonprofit organization that has a series of inventive partnerships with for-profit companies. I think there's a lot we can learn from that.
I'm interested in your including arbitration and privatization. And I wondered if you meant arbitration that is forced as part of a contract of adhesion or court-ordered arbitration or ADR mediation. And if it's the former, how do you apply your models of accountability to arbitration via contract?
Great, great. Well, actually, in the longer version that I've written about this, I have a whole section of privatization discussions about law, because it's very easy for a lawyer to be critical about other sectors, and I thought I'd better look at what's going on for us. And mostly people talked about private prisons, but I actually think that the privatization of dispute resolution is a much bigger phenomenon. I am very worried about these contracts of adhesion, and for the non-lawyers, that's a contract that basically the private individual doesn't have any ability to modify the terms. It's a take it or leave it deal, and if you want the job, which is typically what it is, you have to take it. And what's happened recently is the Supreme Court of the United States has basically approved those agreements, even when they include terms that say people have no access to court to enforce their otherwise existing public rights against discrimination. I'm very worried about that. I think those decisions are wrong. I think that it was completely available for the court to say these violate a variety of doctrines, public and private doctrines. I think the court's wrong about a lot of things. I think that it's something that we should be talking about and something we should be worried about. I think that the legitimacy of those processes is already a joke. Nobody respects an arbitration system where the employer gets to pick the arbitrator, and I think it actually can produce great dissatisfaction in the workplace. Alternatives at the moment, I'm afraid, is just simply going to fuel union movements. It's going to fuel counterproductive activities from some people's perspectives. Other people's perspectives, it might actually mobilize a kind of public engagement around issues of the workplace. That would be a good thing.
You talk about accountability.
Where am I?
What about accountability for public education itself? A lot of the problems is it doesn't behoove an institution to say, we are doing a good job, we need no more money. So therefore, what you're promulgating is the schools want more to do a better job, but there are good schools there that we never look at. There are good systems, and they're not accountable for what they're turning out. They just want more.
Well, you, of course, raise a very important question. If the only reward in the system is to get more money, then everyone's going to be gearing towards more money. I suppose it's some cold comfort to us all that every state in this country is facing the level of deficit that more money is not in the cards in the next 5 years for public education. Every school is cutting. That's not a direct answer to your question. It's a practical answer, however. I think that the deeper answer, though, is something like this. I think it's fair to say that our schools have not, in the past, been publicly accountable. And I support the President's initiative, the Leave No Child Behind Act, in its demand for public accountability. I don't support the particular details. I think that having tests every year of children who are very young is actually a boon to the testing industry, which turns out to be somewhat related to the Bush family, but that's another point. But I think that the general proposition that there should be outcome measures regularly applied to schools is exactly right, and that would begin to cure some of the concerns that you have, so that schools that are doing a good job could demonstrate it and wouldn't have to just be making the case that they need more money because they're not doing a good job.
Shouldn't we be measuring good citizenship of the students coming out of the program and not necessarily just their ability to pass the test?
Well, here's where you and I are absolutely in agreement, and I'm really worried that with the pressures from the current reforms, all kinds of instruction about citizenship, civics, social skills, community responsibility, those are the soft stuff that's being squeezed out of the curriculum, and I think it will be to our detriment. It's also incredibly short-sighted, even if your only goal is to produce responsible and effective workers. The Business Roundtable said the #1 quality they want from graduating high school seniors is an ability to work with others. #1. They said we can teach them to read if they're not doing that. And that's not on these standardized tests. So there's something very counterproductive, and I agree with you about that.
For someone like me who knows very little about privatization, it seems like there's one big danger that you haven't talked about, and at least in some cases of privatization, and I want to ask whether this has been a problem in the past and is a danger in the future, and it has to do with the effects on public decision-making after privatization. So in particular, you might think, in like a paradigm case where this would seem to be a problem is with Lockheed Martin and welfare, or whatever. You might think one thing that's happening when you privatize is you're giving lots of private entities that are in some ways irrelevant in themselves and their own interests, profit maximizing and so on, from the point of view of the basic policy goal. You're giving lots of private entities a stake in the policy-making process. So suddenly, in some cases, depending on how much competition there is and how centralized it is and so on, you're actually maybe giving a disproportionately very powerful private companies a stake in the decision-making process, in the policy process. And so you might think that that really is going to distort the democratic process, both because you have a lot of irrelevant people now who suddenly have a stake in it, and also because some of them are going to be extremely powerful. And so we'll have more of an impact than the relevant actors. So I guess the question I'd ask is it a danger when suddenly a company like Lockheed Martin has an interest in what subsequent welfare laws are? And is that in general?
I think it's a great question. Certainly many people who worry and know more than I do about for-profit prisons have made this argument and claimed that the publicly traded companies now have a huge investment not only in the prison contracts, but in criminal law and making sure that sentences are long. Right, and I don't know how true that is. You know, I haven't seen those companies coming in and lobbying for longer sentences, but you can see the argument and the incentive structure. I'll tell you, it may be naive on my part, but I actually think it would be a good thing to have more people having stake in services to poor people, even if those people include Lockheed Martin. I think that would improve the public debates about services for poor people. It's kind of an argument like this, that some people who generally don't like religious groups are in favor of the president's faith-based initiatives on the theory that, in particular, if you got suburban congregations committed to these kinds of programs, you might actually alter the public politics and strengthen, enlarge the base of support for services for poor people or people with toxic substance or substance abuse problems. And I think that's a very interesting argument. It's related to my bigger concern of who's invested in who else's future. Now, you raised the question with the assumption that the profit-making company is really only interested in its own future. But if we can tie their future to the future of the people who are most disadvantaged in the country, I'm interested in that. That seems to me a very promising possibility. The danger that your comment raises in my mind, and I really have to think some more about this, that if I am arguing for more public processes, say, around the contracting decisions, the Lockheed Martins of the world are much more savvy at stacking a public meeting than anybody else that I know. As we know about, internet rating services, right? You go on the internet to see what consumers think. Those aren't really consumers. Those are people who've been mobilized by the private companies. So you have to figure out how to make the processes not completely manipulable by the most powerful players. I think that this, again, comes back to what I'm calling accountability. Maybe there's a better word for it. If the measures of accountability for the private companies that get the contracts to do welfare to work programs include track where the people go, just don't tell us how few people are still receiving the services. Include, tell us how many people kept jobs, not just for 2 months, but for a year. If it included the real measures of what we want the public program to do, then it would get those companies invested in those measures. And that's a good thing. That's not a bad thing.
Thank you, Martha.
Thank you.
This has been a very stimulating exchange, and we are lucky that you have been chosen as our Kenan lecturer this year. Like the Kenan lecturers who have preceded you, you've planted a lot of interesting seeds and caused a lot of intellectual resonance, and we are very grateful to you for doing that. I know that some of these seeds will continue to blossom in unforeseen ways across the years to come. And one of the things that has been particularly rewarding about your lecture and the questions that followed is the ways in which you have been willing to entertain many different perspectives on some very complicated issues. And as a philosopher, you have always been particularly successful at doing that. Martha and I go back some way as colleagues, and one of the things I've always valued about you, Martha, is your unwillingness to be pinned in by any particular intellectual or ideological polarities. And so, not surprisingly, over the course of time, you've been claimed by either the left or the right or both at once. And all I can say is, Martha, if there is a third hand, you'll be the one to find it. And we can all be sure of that. And it's especially appropriate because the truth is, especially about issues like this, often very multi-layered and very complex. And for someone to be too simplistic in talking about these things may be stimulating, but it's inevitably going to miss some of the nuances that Martha, for example, has so carefully brought to our attention. I know the Q&A could have gone on a lot longer. There were a lot more people with their hands up, but we do need to draw the more formal part of the afternoon to a close. I do hope all of you will join us just across the hall for the reception, that you will continue to pose questions to our lecturer and to each other, and to give answers that will sustain the spirit of this discourse for a long time to come. Thank you very much.